Prof, maybe we can start.
Oke, boleh, insyaallah. Ya.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Professor Syed Musa Al-Habsyi, Associate Professor from IUM Institute of Islamic Banking and Finance. Welcome, Professor, to our 3-in-1 program.
Thank you.
And our dear students, welcome to our 3-in-1 program this morning. Before we begin, let me introduce myself. My name is Muhammad Daniel Vildana as the moderator for this morning. And before we begin, I will read the curriculum vitae of our presenter today, Associate Professor Dr. Syed Musa Syed Jafar Al-Habsyi. Please let me share screen. Okay, here is the CV of Professor Syed Musa Al-Habsyi. He is the Associate Professor in IIUM, and he earned his bachelor degree from IIUM BBA in 1989, and he earned his PhD in Business Administration from Strathclyde University, UK. And his experience, he is the head of accounting department of IIUM, and head of postgraduate Islamic Banking and Finance in IIUM2, head of Center of Postgraduate Studies, Dean of Faculty of Economic of Business Administration, and the last time is the Dean of IABF IIUM from 2017 to 2019. And for today's topic, we will deliver about the Awqaf governance for sustainable economic growth. And I ideally hope that the students here will get an enormous knowledge from him, from Professor Syed Musa, and maybe we can continue to this session, Prof. Okay, and then I will give the time and screen to you, Professor Syed Musa.
You can see my slide. Yeah.
Yes, Prof.
Okay.
Inshallah.
Right. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh and good morning to everyone. Sorry, my throat is clearing, sometimes in the morning you get stuck sometimes. So first of all, thank you. Thank you very much to Universitas Brawijaya, Faculty of Economics, Department of Economics for inviting me to this very important event. It's very interesting to see a speaker of 3-in-1 program, usually when it's 3-in-1, usually I remember the coffee that I drink, you have the milk, the sugar and and the coffee. So here 3-in-1 is also very special. Yeah. And thank you to the faculty, thank you Dandi and of course the dean and the faculty team for inviting me. This is certainly an opportunity for me to have a conversation. I always like to say a conversation because some of this discussion that we have are ideas, some of this discussion are some observations and some insight. And I certainly look forward to a discussion after my short presentation, inshallah. I'll try to keep it maybe within 45 minutes or 1 hour. And from that on, we hope we could be able to try to understand better the topic. As I was given the task to relate governance, to relate Awqaf or Awqaf to sustainable economic growth, I'm always more keen to discuss more from the accounting finance perspective, but I will try to relate as much to the topic where possible. So at any point in time, if you need to ask any questions or even to put in the chat box later on, I hope Bapak Dandi can assist me accordingly. We will go through the the discussion. All right. Now, this is basically the outline that I'm going to take you through. All right. I understand that some of you, or maybe most of you, have done Islamic economics as a course, so some of the things may be repeated, but some of the things could be looked from different perspective. And this is where I try to put up a certain kind of a framework, or we call it a gestalt, putting things together. So my discussion will be very much conceptual. And where relevant, I'll make some references to some recent developments so that you can see some of the challenges that we face. So the topic basically will cover a little bit on the fundamental concepts, the nature of Waqaf, a little bit on the origin, legitimacy, Waqaf classification, 10 stipulations of Waqaf, nature of finance, and Islamic financial services, optimal governance of trust. I think this will be the central argument that we're going to discuss. And then, of course, we also have to look at Sharia governance and socio-economic rules and impact of Waqaf in Islamic finance. So all these topics hopefully will come up to the last diagram later on that I want to propose some kind of a ecosystem to the topic. Right, when we talk about the concepts of wealth in Islam, all right, now we realize that the definition of wealth, I think, is very much related to economic resources. As we understand, even in accounting, when we talk about assets, we talk about economic resources. The economic argument or the economic basis of giving this definition will certainly help us in many respects in terms of our life, living, and livelihood. Now here what I try to put forth to you is, what is the view about wealth? Now this view of wealth, I think is very pertinent before we talk about Waqaf, or we talk about Awqaf, or even before we talk about governance, all right? Because at the end of the day, what is the purpose of governance? Now, if you look at different governance models, all right, each governance model has its primary focus and objective. So I have 3 questions that I would always like to ask about wealth. So the first question will be, what is the purpose of wealth? Okay, in Arabic, we say what is the maqsood of wealth. And today we talk about maqasid al-sharia. So maqasid sharia basically talk about the goals of life itself. Yeah, how do we fulfill a good life? Now, this is where the purpose will come in. So what is the purpose of wealth? Otherwise, now we talk about recycling economy and so on. Why? Because there's a lot of wastage, or even sometimes we call it a lot of leakages, yeah, in the economy. But how do we look at it from the concept of the purpose? What is it meant for? Then, of course, the next thing is, what is the meaning of wealth? what does it mean to us? Okay, certainly this will bring different meaning to different people given different contexts. But in the case of Waqaf, all right, when we look at the purpose of wealth, the meaning of wealth, it will give us another perspective. It will give us a more definite reason why we participate in such an activity and why we want to contribute. And finally, the third point is, what is the benefit, the manfaat? Okay, so the purpose, all right, the meaning, and the benefit. So this, I hope, with these three key questions, we can be guided throughout when we discuss about Waqaf. Now, I have some boxes in yellow there, all right, just to give you some idea about some of the key elements. We talk about ownership, all right? So when we talk about ownership, who is the absolute owner? Now, within the context of the religion of Islam, we always acknowledge that the ultimate owner is the Creator himself. So if he's the ultimate owner, then who are we? We are just the agent, and therefore we are acting in trust. So actually, governance begins with the individual, all right, by virtue of the creation of man himself. So this concept is certainly much more comprehensive and universal, rather than just looking at institutional or activity. So the ownership is very important. Then the legitimacy or the validity of the contracts. Okay, what sort of dealings do we enter into? All right, and then the permissibility of the activities. And finally, the equity and fairness. So if we put all these four attributes together, or the elements together, it will give you some sense of purpose, some sense of meaning, and some sense of benefit that you can arrive. So this can also be used as the core principles to guide what sort of governance that you want to do. Then, of course, later on, we will start talking about what kind of activities are we looking at. So is it trading? Is it estate property? All right. And then on the other hand, what do we do with these activities? All right. Is it expenditure? Is it pricing, production, distribution? And I'm sure, I think all of you in economics would have dealt a lot of time with various economic models to deal with this, whether is it pricing and so on. Now, all this will have implication to Waqaf later on. Then, when we go down to the lower column, all right, the lower row, earnings and income, how do we actually recognize earnings and income? And what sort of civility, what sort of civic consciousness is important in the case of catastrophic loss, adversities, and calamities? How do we deal with this? And then, of course, savings and investments. So this does, if you can see, this is more of just putting the concepts together so that we can have a big view, all right, when we talk about wealth, and particularly here I'm referring to wealth in Islam or wealth for Waqaf. It has its special attributes, all right, and it will keep us to be mindful. Otherwise, we might miss. We just focus on equity, we forgot about pricing, all right, or we just focus on trading, all right, and we forgot about civility, for example. All right, so all these have got to be related somehow. Right now, I go to a bit more specific. All right. Now, the concept of Waqaf is not something new. All right. I've taken quite extensive. In fact, if you refer to Magda Ismail Mohsin and Aisha, the book on institutionalization of Waqaf, it's a very comprehensive book, a good first book. I don't know whether you have this in your reading list, but if you don't, I would encourage you to have a copy. It gives quite a comprehensive, I would say, first reader, learner, yeah, into Waqaf. Of course, there are a lot of other books that we can list later and then we can share. So the concept of Waqaf actually has a very strange history. All right, in a sense, it is more institutional because it does not involve only a single person; it involves a group of persons. All right, an association. So this relate to the need to preserve wealth, all right, to preserve wealth. Now, wealth can, of course, be earned and distributed almost immediately. But for social purposes, how do you preserve the wealth? So this question of ain or property, ownership, dedication, and confinement, that means trying to limit it, all right, trying to keep it permanent, trying to keep it fixed, was the first initial discussion. So you'll notice that in any asset, all right, or any property that we talk about, there's always two components, all right? One, the asset itself, then the beneficial use of the asset. In this case, the usufruct. So we call it the mal and the manfaat. Now, most of us are mistaken by the fact that we thought if we waqaf, it is no different from sedekah. All right? Although, for those who are familiar with charity, the concept evolved from charity, but all right, its permanence make a distinct feature. What is permanent here is the property itself. Now, that has got to be confined, that has got to be preserved. All right? Now, when we move to the next description, all right, which I put here, we start to look into asset itself. All right. So asset will take an economic definition, will also take an accounting definition. And also, when we bring into property, we'll take a legal definition. All right. So you can see three different perspectives. Now, we have to understand each within its context, and we have to also see how they change with different perspectives. Then there's a question about whether should it remain just immovable or can it be movable. Now, I think we should not be mistaken of the fact that even if it is movable, it is still permanent. All right, it is permanent because, as we said, we need to confine. What if it is not? Now, these are where the jurists will discuss. I'm not going to go into that in detail, but just to highlight to you some pertinent feature. Then, of course, the nature of Awqaf itself. Today, as you see, why Awqaf has attracted a lot of interest, because we have started to put Awqaf with finance, and we call it social finance. All right. The interesting development of social finance itself, all right, and how it has evolved, I think has attracted a lot of attention. But we also look at Awqaf as a form of social finance. But is it fair to limit to social finance discipline? Now, this is something that I will discuss further. So as you can see from the diagram, we talk about Awqaf, there is the property, the manfa'ah. The one that is critical is the perpetual manfa'ah, the usufruq. The property, we can talk about some changes to it, all right? But what perpetuality is? Well, now, if this benefit suddenly stop, then what is the purpose of Awqaf? This is a question. Then, of course, confinement. We talk about it has to be alienated, and it is dedicated. All right. What is dedicated for? Now, this is crucial. Huh? So this usufruq has got to be dedicated for some charitable purposes, all right, or some social benefit. Now, in the case of religious, it will be a form of worship. All right. Now, so this is where we need to understand where, if it is treated as a form of worship, it will fall under the religious authority. Okay. But if you're talking about not necessarily in the form of religious worship, then of course it gives much broader interpretation as endowment to the society as a whole. So I think that need to add clarification. Then finally, the target. Who do we target? Is it the private or the public, or both? It could be a mix. All right. Now, previously there were, I mean, if those of you who have read about Awqaf and seen the case of the Ottoman experience, there were a spike of Awqaf. All right. You can see from the graph a huge number of Awqaf. But the question is, why was that only in that period? This is very interesting for us to find out. And later on, after the expansion of the colonies and so on, things change. All right, and we also experienced the same thing in Malaysia. So what was obvious was what left was very much the public. The private becomes reduced. Okay, it becomes reduced. They have their purposes, but as if at the same time we also have their limitations. So one of the issues that we can discuss later on is about governance. Okay. Okay, next is to just highlight to you in terms of religiosity, all right, where some of these ideas. Now, we're not going to confine only to the Quran and Sunnah. I'm sure we can expand to the earlier prophets, right up to Adam alayhi salam, and we can trace the civilization, its development and growth, and we can benefit from collective wisdom. But more important, all right, what is traced here is the spiritual well-being. Okay. In terms of Awqaf, all right, the primary motivation is the spiritual well-being. It's not so much the physical wealth. Although the physical wealth is important, but it has to be accompanied with the right intention, belief, and motivation. So here, if you can see from Surah Al-Imran, which is Surah 3, verse 92, you will only attain righteousness until you give what you love most, to put it simply. Right? So when you talk about charity, do you give what you don't want? Or you give what you want, actually? But you feel your fellow human deserve better than you. That is the principle. All right? Sometimes we get caught. What we don't want, then we give to people. That's a different story. So do you love your you love humanity as you love more than yourself? I think this is the fundamental question. And then the next point is this about the beneficiaries? All right, who are rightful beneficiaries, all right, of this gift? So first you love them, and who are they? And then of course here it is specified, all right, it begins with your family. Now this is where you'll notice sometimes we forgot, our family are not properly taken care of, we go and give to others. So there is a sequence here, and there's also an order: the orphans, the needy, the wayfarer, those who ask. At one time there were slaves, freedom of the slaves, and all these relate to prayer and relate to belief and so on. So this makes the spirit of giving, becomes very crucial. Now, but not much is specified in terms of waqaf, something that is permanent, that is perpetual and so on. When we move to the hadith, then you see the next discussion. Now this is our belief, where we do not confine our belief to only in this world, but our belief relates to the next world, ad-dunya and al-akhirah. Now, this actually make a distinction between what we call the Islamic worldview or the Tawhidic worldview as compared to the conventional or the Western worldview. All right. So we extend it not only to this world. So now there is a higher order. There is a higher goal. Now, what is this higher order, higher goal, and how do you meet it? So there were three things that were mentioned specifically by our Prophet, Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. There are three things. One is recurring charity. That means perpetual charity. Second is the knowledge that will benefit, like what we are doing now. We try to bring a civilization into form, all right, or maybe communities and so on through knowledge. All right, and those who always think well and think good of others, especially think well of their forefathers, always pray for them, all right, especially their parents. So this connection between the father and the son, even in the next world, will continue, or the daughter and so on. So this concept of continuity, all right, and perpetuity is a very important concept relating to spiritual being. It's not that after you have been buried, game over, nothing more. In fact, there's still more that can be done. So this became the very primary motivation, or a very primary motivation for waqaf, okay, for Muslims. Now, when I move to the next hadith, right, and this one is basically the experience of one of the Prophet's companions, all right, which is Umar radiallahu anh, or who actually got a wealth and the land, and the question is, what do I do with it if I want to have perpetual? Then what did the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam says? Simple, you maintain the land and the trees, which are basically the capital, all right, or the capital asset. And what do? Is you benefit this output, these streams, this yield of return, the yield of investment. Now we talk about that in financial terms, to those who are in need. Now this simple distinction between preserving the wealth and distributing the benefits to others becomes a simple concept to explain about waqaf. So you'll notice that all these discussions are relatively coherent, consistent, all right, with the evolution and the determination of waqaf. Any questions before I move to the next slide, please? Okay. If the print is a bit too small, I have already extended a copy to Bapak Dandi, and later on you can have a set to look at it again. Now, there are some particular conditions, all right? Now, all these conditions are important. I need to mention this because it will then be captured in the governance. It will capture in the governance. So, relating to the founder, the contributor, the donor. Okay. Of course, you cannot donate something that is prohibited. Okay. You cannot donate something that is not yours. And do you donate what is already belonging to the government? You know, sometimes I'm puzzled. I'm quite puzzled. You see, this organization, Awqaf. But I ask myself this question: this organization is a public sector entity, you know, because the wealth is already for the public. So why do you have to talk about waqaf? Actually, the concept is from private individuals, from private interest to public interest. I think we have to be clear about that. It's not from public to public. If public to public, I think that is just a rename, because in the first place, it's already for the public. So the direction of waqaf is actually to address the public interest, all right, or the social needs. Then the nature of the asset itself or the property. All right. Now this has attracted a lot of discussion. The key is it has to have permanence. But now we are talking not only in terms of physical, all right, or what is observable and so on. It's also the intangible. All right. So you have intangible assets like intellectual property and so on. Have we not considered this as Awqaf? All right. You write a book, all the proceeds of the collection from the book, you give it to those in needy. And I know of many of such scholars, Sharia scholars who do that. They write and then they say, okay, you sell this book, but don't worry about the proceeds. The proceeds all give it to the needy. Okay. For me, this is a Awqaf. So in that sense, it gives that liberty of the feeling of charitable, even in terms of the work that is being done. So the asset itself, the property, it has to be determined. It cannot be something that is arbitrary. Otherwise, we'll have a problem. The one that is now becoming more and more challenging, all right, when you talk about Awqaf and social economic being as well as growth, is the people in the Awqaf, all right, the managers, all right. Now, sometimes we notice that in the model, they put the manager and the administrator together. Later on, I'll take you one slide to make a clear distinction between the two, all right? Certainly, when we talk about the manager is the one who focuses more on the activities. In that sense, it's more behavioral, all right? So that's why we talk about agency theory and so on. It's very much behavioral. So you understand the behavior, then you can respond and do what is best, okay? But then there is also the other, which is the supervisor, if I just jump first from the beneficiaries. Now, these are the administrators, all right? So they are the one like the trustee who monitor the covenant and so on. Now, if you put the two together, then what happens? Governance can collapse. Governance can collapse. Now, there are situations which you say the founder is also the manager. It's possible. There's no issue about that. Or the founder could also be the manager and also the supervisor. Then it most likely sounds like a family Awqaf, okay, rather than a public Awqaf, because it is the whole thing is his. He just wants to put it there and he wants to manage it. Fine. But if you put it in the public sector accountability issue, all right, in domain, then of course the question is, do you still keep it as private or is it now public? And how do we ensure proper accountability? Because now, like, deposit taking and so on, if you look at it from the financial side, you are given the license before you can collect funds. So the same thing, if you are running a Awqaf, there must be some form of authority overseeing this to regulate, to ensure that it's properly done. So understanding the elements, all right, and the conditions here is crucial. Then, of course, the beneficiaries. All right, whether this is in the mandate and clearly spelled out or otherwise. So all these conditions are key. Of course, we should not necessarily limit to this, but I would consider that if you miss any of this, we can have a challenge. We can have a challenge in terms of the effective implementation or governance of Awqaf. Now, some restrictions, in bracket, I call it options. Actually, initially, it was seen as trying to limit the nature of Awqaf. But at the same time, it also gives some options. Okay, let's talk about irrevocability, that it is irrevocable, all right? So that means you are saying that once you have given Awqaf, you cannot take it back. Now, does it make sense? Yes, it does to a certain extent when you discuss this in terms of permanence. But later on, I'm going to highlight to you that despite this, all right, there are situations where it warrants you to review again and say, maybe now I should divert the resources of the Awqaf to something else, all right, rather than retain. You see, we had at one time, okay, let me share with you a little bit of a background, yeah? Many people question, all right, and said, why this traditional Awqaf is so restricted? For example, there are only three things that they were concerned of. Number one, when you have a Awqaf, build a mosque. Number two, you have Awqaf, build a madrasa. And number three, have a grave. Okay, very simple, right? But for others, they say it's very restrictive. Now, let's go back to history, or let's go back to the early founders. Why were they thinking along that line? Now, if you happen to be in a country where you are a minority, I was from Singapore, all right, I understand what a minority feel. Now I'm in Malaysia, and both I was Singaporean, now I'm Malaysian. Okay, when you are in a country minority, you will be thinking of these three things very seriously. Number one, the place where you want to pray. There are still some places in overseas, all right, where they have to share with the church, all right, common halls to pray together. Okay. Now, to me, is there anything wrong to that? Obviously, we can do time sharing and so on. But what if you have your own? So that's where the priority will come. And then second, the education of your children. All right. In such situation, would madrasah be top priority? Yes, it will be. And then where are you going to be buried? Anywhere? Don't you have a proper burial ground? So if you go back to history and you see why this came about, there must be reasons. But it doesn't mean that after you have done this, Waqaf is only limited to that. All right. Obviously, you can expand. Now we're talking about shopping complexes. We are talking about research and development. We are looking at a whole range of even hospitals. All right. And I know some universities, I mean, as early as 60s, including Brawijaya, they are based on endowments. All right. And all these universities are initiated by egalitarian people who are very highly spirited to serve the community. And it's recognized until today, and we continue that. So in that sense, all right, it expands. It expands and it takes a much broader role. And so much so that I think if you read some of the early history about Waqaf, you will realize that there were some communities where the person says, since cradle to death, all right, all my life has been supported by Waqaf. I don't have to pay for my education. I don't have to pay for the place I sleep. I don't need to stay in hotels. There are enough places for travelers to stay for 3 days for free, because that was how the Muslim community operate. Now, how does this happen if not for Waqaf? All right. So there were bountiful benefits. All right. So, but then when times change, I have a building. All right, it was used for this. Now, can I reuse this building for something else so that the benefits continue? Now, this is where the irrevocable issue has got to be addressed. The second is with regard to time frame. All right, when we talk about time frame, we talk about perpetuity. All right, how long does it continue, and for what purposes? All right, so we need to talk about the capacity. We need to talk about the allocation, optimizing the allocation. We also need to talk about maximizing the performance within this period. So the sustainability of the proceeds. And the third, of course, the most important, all right? What is it primarily for? The alignability, the confinement of this wealth, all right? So here, if you say it's for public charity, make sure it's for public charity, don't mix it up, all right? Of course, you have investments that you do to continue to regenerate the benefits, that's fine. But even then, I think we can also discuss to what extent cash Waqaf. I mean, there's a lot of discussion about cash Waqaf. I didn't include specifically. You can raise this question, we can discuss. Is sustainable if it remains cash, all right? Or is it just a temporal solution, right? Something that we can discuss. All right, so let me move on to the next slide. All right, this is just to give you a quick diagram, all right, for you to see, all right, the classifications that I have put forward. First, when we talk about the timing itself, is it permanent? Is it temporary? So within that certain time frame, it may be remain as a fixed asset. After that, it could be a revolving asset, all right, or basically a circulating capital, but it's still maintained as Waqaf, all right, for use, because you know that you can efficiently mobilize it, all right. Then, is it for what purpose? Is it family or charity? I have mentioned to you about Ahli and Khairi, yeah, the classification. Or you have a combination with each mushtarak. Is it general or is it specific? Is it targeted? Then object, can it be movable or immovable? Now, later on, I'm going to talk a little bit about securitization, all right, because it's now becoming popular to issue sukuk relating to Waqaf. There are some issues there as well, and then we can discuss this, yeah. So if we put this at the back of our mind, between how it was traditionally, now we want to bring into a broader financing, funding perspective, or even investment perspectives of Waqaf to ensure its sustainability, to ensure its growth. Or sometimes we say we want to unlock the value of Waqaf. All right, we want to unlock the value of Waqaf, then certainly we have to re-examine the methods and the methodologies that we have adopted. Now, this was taken from the Hanafi school. I'm sure you're familiar, there are at least two schools. You have the Maliki school and the Hanafi school. Maliki school is very much textual, very much related to what was being narrated and passed on. Hanafi tends to be more intellectual, more rationalization school. All right, they always try to come up with solutions. So in that sense, I make a citation here just to make reference to see the flexibility. So the flexibility in terms of the covenant itself, all right, where the proceeds need to be relocated, all right. In other words, in budget, okay, I'm sure when every time the parliament has approved the budget, everybody's happy, especially the election is coming, like Malaysia, we have election coming and then we approve the budget, everybody's happy, yeah. But after that, what happens? You have environment, okay, in public sector budgeting. There is very powerful concept called environment. All right. What do you mean by environment? You relocate the resources because the government now thinks that after post-budget review, you notice there are more important urgent things. So there will be environment. So the same thing here that we talk about. All right. Now, can you actually relocate the benefits of this Waqaf? Not only directly to targeted. Now, if they do that, then certainly you have to take this into consideration in your covenant. You have to take this into consideration in your governance perspective. Then also, who are the beneficiaries? All right, especially in terms of need improvement. So there will be some flexibility there as well. All right, to exclude or to include. All right, and then at the same time, you may want to terminate some beneficiaries or to add a new one. All right. So we are granting new benefits. So you can see these changes actually is trying to tell us something. All right. Despite its permanence, all right, it may be land, but who use the land? What is it used for? You may change it from agriculture to industry, all right, or to tourism, for example, provided it fulfills the covenants and the requirement. Then, of course, replacement and conversion, tabdil. Flexibility to replace obsolete with more relevant asset. Okay, here is talking about not only the physical but the productive capacity of Waqaf itself. All right, and you notice a lot of literature saying we have lots of lands, but they are underutilized, less productive. So what do you do? Okay, I think there is a concept called istibdal, and for those who have been actively reading on this, will see that there are a lot of opportunities, all right, to switch, to swap assets, to swap property. Now, all these came from these stipulations, all right. So what actually is happening now is we are giving more flexibility to Waqaf. But the question is, okay, the question is, do we still preserve the identity of Waqaf? Or it became so convoluted we forgot and lost what was the purpose at the origin, at the beginning. Right? Do we lose that sense of original purpose? That's why I go back to the three questions: the purpose, all right, the meaning, and the benefit. If you can be guided by these three questions, I think you'll be all right. Right? You won't have to be too worried. Okay, now let me move to finance. All right, because after this, I'm going to converge the two so that you can see why I am taking this argument. Now, finance as a discipline, all right, and as a body of knowledge. Now, to me, most of you are economists by training, I would say. Finance is applied economics, all right? But financial management is not. There's a slight difference there, all right? Because when you see the literature on finance from the 70s, right? If you read from the 70s, you will notice that finance is very much driven by the markets. Unlike financial management, it was driven very much by the institutions. So a lot of accounting data of the institutions was very much used to build the field of study of financial management. In fact, you can see the word management there. But when you move into finance, you will notice that there is more market data, and especially with the price and so on, finance became even more sophisticated, all right, and very expanded. That's why somebody who is trained in finance may not necessarily be adequate in financial management. That's where accounting comes in, to fill in the gaps within the two. So here, when we talk about finance and financial management, we see already a broad role. Now, where is Waqaf in finance, all right, or the finance topic that we look about? So basically, I am looking at the institution itself, and I'm looking at the activity of social finance, right? Now, we have even expanded now to corporate Waqaf, All right, we have already expanded now to sukuk. Okay, so whether you like it or not, you will interface. All right, Waqaf will interface with any of this or even investments. Okay, so that it will become more relevant, it will have higher visibility, and it will be able to capture more funds in that sense, yeah, or even attract more contributors or donors. Now, when we look at value, okay, value is very important. Okay, when you look at value in finance, okay, I always indicate that we are not only talking about shareholder value, although that's what corporate finance always tell us. But don't forget where the cash flows come from. The cash flows come from the customer. So customer value will always be important. Don't bother start a business if you don't have customers. Okay, because you have to know who your customers are before you start. I mean, these are basically business acumen questions. So the shareholders only actually capture, are invested if you see value, and that value comes from customers. Now, to sustain this value, what do your stakeholders think? Okay, so this value creation, value origination, value transfer, value sharing, if I can use the word, is actually real. All right, it's just a question of we see it as a group or not. Now, if I take this model and I put it into Waqaf, all right, I don't see much different, especially if it is institutional. Although the motivation may be a bit different, one be very commercial, but the other one will be more social, for example, or public in nature. So these are things that I want you to think about, all right, but surely you can come up with something better than this. But as a pedagogical tool, all right, we are interested in sustainable value, all right. So sustainable value will be a composite of shareholder value as well as customer value. Right? Now, what is the problem of finance? Okay, I think in economics you must have spent a lot of time. You've got all the theories and you've got all your tools, right? But we still talk about the same problem, right? There is on one side, which is the opportunistic behavior. Not opportunity seeking. Opportunity seeking is very encouraged. That is entrepreneurial spirit. Entrepreneurial spirit always look for new opportunities. But then the problem of opportunity seeking. And then the opportunistic behavior will lead to moral hazard, adverse selection. All right. So it becomes an ethical problem. But usually our arguments is, if I have an institution, this institution can do it more efficiently. So I say efficient allocation of resources. But is that necessarily true? All right. Or is it the reverse? After a while, everybody else suffered losses, but they continue to make profits. All right. Then it raises questions. What is happening? Is there a distribution problem or is that a pricing problem? So I move to the second one, all right, which is efficiency and equity. So when we talk about efficiency and equity, and the same thing later on, we can discuss this within the context of Waqaf, right? We are talking about performance, we are talking about price, we are talking about inputs, we are talking about cost. Most of the time we talk about efficiency. But what about equity? What about fairness? All right. This is sometimes we just say it will be taken care of. Does that always true? Not necessarily. Sometimes you need government intervention and so on to come into correct market distortion and so on. But at the same time, you cannot totally regulate it, then you have serious problems. So this balance between efficiency and equity, or the need to fulfill both, I think is something that now Islamic finance is supposed to deal with this ethical problem of finance. But because when we look at it only from Sharia perspective, we begin by looking at the legitimacy of the contracts first, the legitimacy of the products, the permissibility of the activities. But when we come to these questions, then what do we say? Or it's a business call. The business decide. They know how to survive better. But there are some still fundamental muamalah principles that we need to look at to ensure efficiency and equity. Now, this will bring to governance. All right. Later on, we'll talk about the Sharia governance. So what is Islamic finance? All right. To me, simply, it's a behavior. Okay. And this behavior will have to be within a certain belief system. All right. On a belief system of set of values. Okay. When you talk about belief, you'll refer to a set of values that could be commonly shared. It could be shared values. Now, then it has to be guided. Okay. Otherwise, we'll have a challenge. how do you make decisions if it is not guided? Okay, could it be random and so on? And then there will be principles and rules. This will manifest in the form of products, instruments, and services within a framework. So if I'm going to put Waqaf inside this definition, certainly we will re-examine what do we mean by Waqaf assets, what do we mean by Waqaf products, what do we mean by Waqaf services, and all this will expand the definition in a consistent, coherent manner. Otherwise, we will continue to debate, all right? We continue to debate whether we can use it or we cannot, unless we have a collective framework to look at it, yeah? But ultimately, we go back to the goals, all right, of the maqasid of Sharia. Going back to my first question, what is the purpose, all right, which is maqasid of Sharia. Now, the other thing is the institutional forms, all right, that can support Waqaf. Now, you notice that we have different definitions of Islamic financial institution. You look at different documents, they give you different description, and there is a reason to it, by virtue of the nature of the institution. Whether is it just an Islamic financial institution, whether is it an institution offering Islamic financial services, or an Islamic development financial institution. But now we are talking about social finance institution. Okay. Now the one that is very much government engaged is the development finance institution. If you're talking about the Islamic Development Bank, and I think you have Bank Muamalah in Indonesia and so on, yeah, there is a lot of concerted effort to focus on certain targets and certain objectives relating to national objectives. But when you look into social finance, then what happens? It opens up, all right? It gives more empowerment. It allows more sharing, all right? It allows social equity, social awareness. Now, how does this fit in? Now, which one would be most appropriate for Waqaf if I am looking at it within the institutional perspective? Okay. Now, to talk about governance, all right, and just reduce it to regulation, all right, just to reduce it to regulation as a factor, I think can be very limiting, can be very limiting. So what I've taken, this one I presented some time ago in one of IFSB conference. I just reactivated it just to share with you what was presented. Are we looking at the relationship between the investor and manager, particularly? Because that's where it all begins. In this case, we are talking about the contributor and the manager or the donor. Are we looking at the organizational structure? All right. Are we looking at the processes? Whether is it internalization or transaction costs, especially when we talk about cost economies, all right? Are we looking at statutory or social disclosure, all right? Because all these will have to fall into it. Where is the role of mutawali? For example, the founder versus mutawali perspective, mutawali versus beneficiaries, all right? And then proprietary transparency. All these are important discussions in governance, especially when we talk about optimality or optimal governance of trust. Okay, so this question about optimal governance requires us to do a lot of balancing, all right? In the sense that you want to ensure that whatever trade-off decisions that you make, it will be in the best interest of what you set out, okay? So performance versus value, profitability versus liquidity. I think those who are in finance will understand this very clearly as all those in monetary, yeah? Now, one more point that I just want to highlight about the concept of trust. Yeah, from an institutional perspective, there will always be three vertices. All right, what is the authority that is the mandate that is given? What is the responsibility, the tasks and duties that have to be executed, and what will be the reporting framework? Now, all this you can see a lot of efforts and initiatives, and I think in ASEAN, I think Indonesia has been the most aggressive. The publications coming out from Waqaf, I think, is numerous, yeah, and you are supported by a lot of social projects, yeah, and certainly it's something that we certainly got to acknowledge, and maybe we can learn from you. But whatever it is, I always encourage to think in terms of these three vertices. Okay, if you act without authority, it can be problematic, and this can happen, right? Especially those who want to set up an orphanage but can never sustain the orphanage. You are doing injustice to the orphans, all right, more than to bring benefits to them. So in other words, shouldn't there be proper governance before you set up an orphanage? All right. If you want to have a bank, you must have a couple of billion ringgit, right, to show your solvency status. But if you want to do good, you can do as you like. Would it cause more harm or does it bring benefit? Shouldn't there be some kind of infrastructure? Shouldn't there be some kind of supervision or support? So that authority will always have to be there. Then, of course, the responsibility, the task to carry out. Do they have the capacity to do it? And is there reporting? Now, I think if we put these three in mind and we apply this to governance of Awqaf, I think the same questions will be asked. Yeah. Now, the other thing that I want to highlight here, this one is the one that I presented to Kuwait. Sorry, the slides, I still have the logo there. When we talk about governance, right, you notice most governance literature will go straight to define from OECD document. Now, I want to take it a bit more to distinguish between administration and management. Okay. Now, when I started the MBA program in UI 94-95 with Dr. Obiatullah, I'm sure some of you have know Professor Obiatullah. We had quite a big debate about putting law as a subject in MBA. All right. Now, the argument is administration. You take out law, you will miss out the administrative part. Okay. Today, you will notice MBA schools have put in corporate administration. Now, what happens after that when they followed the US model of MBA? You have many managers who have committed breach of trust. Simply put, the legal aspect, understanding the legal administration. So I'm still on this journey and say, please bring back. Although management was popular with Drucker all the while, but don't forget about administration. Now, both are just important in governance. So when we discuss about Awqaf, administration becomes also very, very important. That's why it's good to separate between mutawali, which is the management, and the supervisor, right? So the wazir. So here, the nazir, sorry. So the nazir will be the administrator. Now, why are they different? What do they do differently? One focus very much on the behavior, on performance, on strategy. The other one will focus more on policy, on procedure, on requirement, on governance. In accounting, we also have two groups of accountants. We have the management accountants and the financial accountants. All right. The financial accountants will focus very much on the financial administration and compliance. The management accountant will focus more on the costing, performance, value, strategy. Of course, it can be done by both. But if you have that specialist, you have that clarity. All right. But of course, both still can report to the same CFO. Then we go into some pillars and modalities. Yeah. So you have governance models, whether is it procedural, whether is it corporate, whether is it community, whether is it network. All right. Some even put another level, contract governance. So which governance is appropriate for Awqaf? I think most of us at the moment are using the institutional, all right, which we have taken from the corporate governance. The Sharia governance, later on I'll share with you, is basically a replica of corporate governance with some changes. And that's why I think sometimes we need to look at it again. We have some problems of definition of Sharia review and so on as well as Sharia audit. So here, when you talk about governance model, was it procedural? Whether is it corporate, community, network? Now, where would it be for Awqaf? Which would be more appropriate? But the key pillars will still be there: independence, accountability, fairness, responsibility, and transparency. Okay, Sharia governance. How many more minutes I've got? 10 more minutes, yeah? Yeah, Andy? Yeah.
Yeah, around 10 minutes. Professor.
Okay, I'll try to wrap it up in 10 minutes. So when we talk about Sharia governance, maybe I give a little bit of a history, yeah? The initial discussion about the governance, Sharia governance, actually came from AOFI, all right? The early documents of GSFI 1, GSFI 2. Okay, you can look at this. Then later it was brought to IFSB. At the same time, the individual countries are beginning to experiment and bring the concept of Sharia in governance. Now, in the 80s, it was corporate governance that became popular, all right, with the statements of how corporate governance. And then, of course, OECD came in, firm it up, and then later on, you have. Now, all this came out when there is a debate between self-regulation and external regulation. Okay, so self-regulation means what? The professional body decide what is best. without the interference of the regulators. External regulations say, no, the market fails. You guys cannot do it. We have to look at it. So you have the regulatory parties coming in. So finally, you have a mixed match of both. So you have the professional body and the regulators. Then came governance. All right. So governance, some people will look at it as legal, regulatory. Some look at it behavioral, social, and some look at it as professional. All right. And governance begin with compliance and then move to audit and now risk. So you actually got all three inside there. All right. So now if I take this and put to Sharia, so what happens? Okay. So what are we governing? Do we govern the Sharia or what? If you say corporate governance, yes, we govern the corporation, but Sharia governance? No, is Sharia need to be governed or something is wrong, right? It is Sharia non-compliance. So you see the language is not complete yet. What we meant is Sharia non-compliance behavior that need to be governed. We have to be clear because Sharia is pristine. You know, it comes from revelation, akli and nakli. How can you govern it? So it's Sharia compliance behavior. Or Sharia risk, for example. Even Sharia risk, what do you mean? Sharia non-compliance risk. Actually, that's what it meant. Yeah. Otherwise, it becomes a mockery, actually. Yeah. Because the word is such pristine. Anyway, we understand it, but when we want to explain, we better clarify what we mean. So this structure of governance begin with internal control system. If you're talking about self-governance, and then it becomes with regulation and requirements if you're talking about external. So this combination of both build the governance system, right? So that's where you will notice, like now I understand in Indonesia, you even have already a Awqaf board, right? With all the components and so on. I don't want to repeat this because I know you are aware of this, but I would just want to relate that the Awqaf board was developed based on Sharia governance. Right? Based on Sharia governance. Now, it's good to start, but I think you still need to see the dimensions, huh? Because certainly there are other aspects of governance that you may want to look at. So here is where I put these three together, right? So when we talk about regulation, supervision, oversight, you have regulation. Okay, you can come up with all the legislations and guidelines. That's fine. That provide clarity, that provide comparability, consistency, istiqamah, and so on. Great. Then you need a pool of scholars. Now, who are they? Should we limit to just the Sharia scholars, or the Sharia board comprise actually a combination of scholars? All right, scholars who are very familiar with religiosity. At the same time, they are also familiar. Now, this is the direction that we have been doing with as far as the financial sector is concerned. That we know that to articulate especially the concepts and the practice and the principles to Sharia. All right, you need another group of people. All right, and that's where I've been doing most of the time, trying to bridge this gap where relevant. All right, so the Sharia board is not just a single group, but it's a composite. Of course, when it comes to fatwa and specific rulings, it has to be the expertise. But when it comes to the operational requirements, you need the multidisciplinary approach. Then, of course, when you set up your board, you set up your audit and governance. So whether that's what we should be thinking of next, when you talk about from the Awqaf board, well, it has an audit committee, it has its governance committee, or it has its risk committee. These are questions that we can talk about. Yeah, but usually now we are a bit more proactive when we start introducing risks in the discussion of Sharia non-compliance. Previously, only after it happens. Now there are some mitigation, some preventive mitigation aspects that we will do in terms of compliance. So this will be the control functions that we can think of, except that the market discipline may not be as relevant for Awqaf. We can discuss this later. All right, now to go into the socio-economic roles. Okay, so primarily I go back to the issue of religiosity, because once you use the term Awqaf, like in Malaysia, it's gazetted. Yeah, it's gazetted that Awqaf is a religious phenomena, and it will be within the religious body. But if you don't use Awqaf, you can use Islamic endowment, whatever. It gives more flexibility. It doesn't have to be, because Awqaf has got. Then the other thing is what comes next. Of course, education. What comes next is poverty, welfare. What comes next is healthcare. So to me, this would be the primary thing, yeah, which everyone most likely will benefit, yeah. But then when you go into something more specialized, where you feel there is a need for leverage, then we can start identity as the secondary. It could be agriculture environment, it could be entrepreneurship and employment, especially you talk about the asnaf entrepreneurship and so on. You talk about wealth distribution, special purpose. Now, public funding and community welfare. I think this one, we have to go back to the early literature in the 60s. In the 60s, a lot of Awqaf is discussed, but not separately from Baitul Mal. Okay, so they always talk about Baitul Mal and Awqaf. Here today, we talk about Awqaf, but we don't mention anymore about Baitul Mal. You notice, yeah? You see a shift there. Now then what happens? Okay, we have a missing link there. Because what worked very well was the Baitul Mal. That means there must be some authority, there must be some form of public infrastructure to support. And I'm sure now when you start announcing Awqaf projects and funds, one of the challenge is to achieve your target of collectability, right? Yes. Now, why is that so? Now, these are very, very fundamental questions that we got to ask. The community can support, but there is a limit to it, all right? I give a simple example, okay? This is because of my, I would say about 1/3 now. Previously, half my life was in Singapore, half in Malaysia, okay? When Singapore at that time faced problem about meeting the Muslim community needs, they came out with mosque building fund, okay? Now, we never call mosque building fund as Awqaf fund, right? But if you look at the characteristics dedicated to build mosque, it's actually Awqaf. But it's not called Awqaf fund. So every salary earned, just put $2 just $2 only. And you collect by the population, the workforce, you know how many million. So every year, almost every year, a housing estate mosque is built, like a community center. So it was systematically done until all housing estates have got a mosque which is fully equipped. All right, repair, maintenance, service, what have you, end to end. It's not the government, it's the fund from the Muslim community. Yeah, and there are also non-Muslim who wants to contribute. They say, I would like to, because it's good. If my neighbor is good person, I don't have a problem. All right, so they contributed, and it became a system by itself. Now, you don't call it a Awqaf mosque Awqaf fund, but it worked. All right, it's just a mosque building fund. All right, there's also education fund for the Muslims and so on. So in a minority state, these things work very well without having to go into the semantics and the polemics, provided we got the structure and we can still bring benefit to everyone. So this is where I always felt that some form of government intervention can be helpful, but overly, that could be challenging. Of course, there could be other issues as well. Now we talk about the flood. We talk about the earthquake, so many catastrophic loss. Do we generate Awqaf fund for this? These are questions that we got to ask, yeah, in terms of sustainability. And then animal care, everybody's talking about animal rights as well. Now, initiatives. Now, these are some of the instruments that have been used, all right? Whether it is a long-term lease, all right? Basically related to land, all right? Now, this means what? Means the one who is the founder, the contributor could not do so much with the land. So it passed to the administrator pass it to the manager manage it and try to generate the yield. So you have second, third party coming in. Or dual lease, all right, where you actually expand the scope and purpose. In other words, you have a lease and then you also have a sublease or substitution of it, or advance rental, all right, for refurbishment. And then that rental will actually become part of Awqaf. So all these initiatives, all right, actually provide flexibility in terms of implementation. And all this would have impact: valuation, redevelopment, commercialization, industrialization, securitization, as well as redistribution. This will have the wealth impact. Right. Now, the diagram that I want to share with you. This one just came out from me while I was in Singapore. In fact, I just came back from Singapore yesterday. There was a wedding over the weekend. Met relatives who I never met for the past 20 years sometimes, you know. You miss them for so long. So what I want to put together is some kind of an ecosystem. All right, I won't call it a framework. Something that you may want to think about it. Okay, we start from the left. You always have sometimes the one that give you a good kickoff will be a strategic founder. All right, somebody who has got wealth and direction and say, okay, I want to establish this. Then you have the regular contributor. Okay, so you have two groups, right? One that could be contributing monthly and so on, but there will be one that will be the same because that is the one that's going to set the pace. Then, of course, you have the Nazir. Sorry, I put both Nazir. I'm sorry. This one should be Mutawalli, the one below. I just change this. So we have the Nazir, which is authorized or empowered supervisors, administrators. So there must be some kind of authority to ensure this. And then the qualified professional manager. Now, this is another thing. Now, I have a lot of comments, even from my students when they write their term paper and project paper. You know, they should do ACCA course and all that, all this Nazir from the... Well, I think we look at it from a different context, okay? Because their administration or management is not for corporate, pure corporate. It is not shareholders' wealth. You're talking about community. That's why now we have a concept, socialpreneur, right? And I'm sure you are familiar with this. So the mindset is different. So these managers that we talk about will have a different mindset. Of course, they still look at performance, but different type of performance, the performance objectives and so on. Then what do we do? Which kind of institutions are we going to? We may have a combination. We may have a social financial institutions. We may have something like state authorities. Now, then you can have a blend of both. The regulation may be different, the focus and transparency, but certainly we need to have both. My suspect is if we just have one, you may have a challenge. Then, of course, the modus operandi, all right, which I've already mentioned about initiatives and those who benefits. Now, there are a few more things that I'm going to, this diagram is work in progress. Now, later on, when I complete it, I will share with you in a paper, inshallah, I will publish and share it with you. So some of my short summary, all right? So since the 60s, we talk about Baitul Mal, public treasury, as exemplified by the caliphate system. Now, we have different types of political systems. Certainly, we can still adapt when necessary. And some of the roles of the Baitul Mal are really taken by various institutions. It's just a question of how do we see this. Now, certainly cannot be ignored. If you ignore, they may affect the sustainability of Awqaf. Then, of course, the drive toward SDG, ESG is fine, but we may want to redefine this within our socio-cultural context, also our religious beliefs and values. So despite this development of Waqaf infrastructure in terms of framework and so on, I think the measures, in addition to performance, is outreach. Okay. How much do we reach out? In simple terms, are you a giver more than a taker? All right. A Waqaf community works when you give more than you take. Even a smile is a gift, right? So we need to cultivate that belief system, the spiritual being that I talk about. Always love to share, always love to give, because you know it will benefit everyone and yourself directly or indirectly. And the third one will be a mixed model of regulatory support with social incentives. There must be social incentives, because if it is not, who wants to put? So sometimes you put tax incentives and so on. But I would say these are only the initial catalysts. But once they see the benefit of Waqaf for their generations to come, not only for them, I think it becomes automated. I think on that note, wallahu alam, shukran wa salam, assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you so much. Yeah, I think I exceeded 5 minutes.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you, Prof. Syed Musa, for the amazing presentation. And maybe I will open the first Q&A session for 3 participants. And if you have trouble to speak in English, maybe you can speak in Bahasa and I will convey to Professor Syed Musa.
No problem. I'll try to answer in Bahasa Indonesia also.
Okay, okay, Prof. Okay.
Yeah,
okay,
okay.
dipersilakan mungkin bagi yang ingin bertanya, teman-teman kepada Prof. Syed Musa, silakan. Untuk sesi ini saya buka 3 pertanyaan dulu. Silakan. Mungkin masih malu-malu ini, Prof, sama siswa kita ini.
Dia kalau dia tak tanya, saya akan tanya.
Kalau tidak tanya, Prof Musa akan tanya balik.
No, anything, not necessarily direct to topic, indirect pun okay juga.
Ya,
Anything of interest, please.
ya. Ada yang ingin bertanya mungkin? Itu 3 pertanyaan. Oke, kalau belum mungkin saya bertanya sedikit. Tadi cukup menarik, Prof, terkait dengan Islamic finance ya, relate to Islamic finance. You speak about it's like a behavior, and it's based on values and guided principles. Yang mana memang ketika kita compare dengan conventional finance, dia tidak bicara mengenai guided principles, tidak sama seperti kita gitu. Tapi bagaimana Prof untuk misalnya kita mengekalkan prinsip seperti itu di masa di mana everything is heavily influenced by the West? Bagaimana Prof kira-kira?
Okay. I always like to relate to the ethical theory. Kalau kita merujuk pada ethical theory itu sendiri, dia ada 2 group. Satu dia panggil the consequentialist. They call it the teleological. And then you have the deontological, which are the principle centered. Jadi sebenarnya di barat itu pun mereka iktiraf dua-dua ni. Mereka iktiraf bahawa ethics itu boleh dilihat dari segi empirical dan juga boleh dibentuk dari empirical itu sendiri. Kita pula lebih menjurus kepada prinsipal sebab kita ada elemen nakli. Di mana ada tu memang kita tak boleh buat keputusan sendiri seperti umpamanya suicide, euthanasia. Sebab kita melihat kehidupan ni adalah sebagai amanah, bukan hak kita. Berbalik dengan mereka yang merasa begitu. Jadi pertemuannya itu ialah dengan evidence. Jadi pertemuannya itu dengan evidence. Jadi evidence yang kita dapat lahirkan kepada barat bahawa sistem yang kita nak cadangkan ini memang efektif. Maka dari situ mereka akan melihat dari the law of large numbers dan sebagainya itu, from the teleological perspective, consequentialist, mereka akan mengambil. Kemudian akhirnya dengan prinsip-prinsip sekali. Jadi penemuan tu saya rasa penting. Sebab kadang-kadang kita hanya bercakap atau retorik saja. Tapi kalau kita dapat melaksanakan dengan strategi, dengan evidence dan sebagainya, dan lengkap. Dan satu lagi, untuk kita tidak ada masalah kalau kita ambil governance structure dia dan kita ubah sesuai, tidak salah. Tapi jangan sampai kita hilang identiti kita. Itu kita kena jaga. Kat situ mungkin satu cabaran lah. Sebab kalau kita guna structure yang dia dah guna pakai, mudah untuk dia faham. Structure kita bagaimana berbeza dan bagaimana boleh ada pertemuan.
Berarti memang Barat pun mengiktiraf apa yang ada di Islam berarti Prof ya?
Ya.
Oke, mungkin ada yang ingin bertanya? Any questions from the participant? There is a question Prof in the chat box. Izin bahasa, melihat jumlah hutan di Indonesia, bagaimana seharusnya pemerintah ataupun masyarakat dalam kegiatan pengoptimalan potensi wakaf forestry? In the terms of wakaf forest, Prof.
Ya, betul.
The potential wakaf forest.
Ada satu PhD daripada IBF, wakaf forest management. Saya diberi peluang sebagai examiner. Internal examiner. Saya rasa itu sangat menarik dan dia boleh membawa satu kebaikan yang lebih sustainable lah, sebab kita melihat dari sudut ESG itu kan. Cuma persoalan yang saya timbul ialah kuasa di atas forest dan sebagainya, adakah itu lebih, kalau ni balik pada dia punya law of the land dia lah, land law dan sebagainya, adakah lebih kepada pemerintah, Jadi kalau di pemerintah maknanya sudah public itu kan. Tapi yang menjadi menarik ialah management of the forest itu. Jadi management itu boleh ke kita wakafkan management itu. Jadi kat situ memang satu usaha yang saya rasa baik, dan cuma sistem tu kena jelaskan di mana haknya pemerintah, di mananya haknya wakaf, dan bagaimana common objective itu tercapai. Kalau dibiarkan saja kepada wakaf, kadang-kadang ada masalah ya. Dari segi keputusan yang perlu dibuat untuk environment keseluruhannya lah ya. Lebih-lebih lagi nak menjaga wakaf forest itu daripada diceroboh ya. Bahasa Indonesia apa? Ceroboh juga kan? Ya. Maknanya transgress, is being transgress, kemudian dibuat untuk pembangunan dan sebagainya. Itu isu yang masih berlaku. Logging dengan illegal logging dan sebagainya itu. Itu dari segi protection tu saya rasa perlu perundangan, dan dari segi penyelenggaraan itu mungkin kita boleh melihat dengan lebih luas ya.
Okay, thank you Prof for the answer for the questions. Ada lagi yang ingin bertanya? Mungkin ada yang ingin bertanya lagi? Okay, maybe there is only one question, Prof, for today's event from the participant.
Tapi kalau nak tanya besok pun boleh.
Okay, insyaAllah ya.
Saya akan cuba jawab ya.
Okay. InsyaAllah besok kita masih ada satu session lagi dari Profesor Syed Musa tentang metodologi for Islamic Economics and Finance ya. So stay tuned. If you want to join our session tomorrow, I will send the link. Yeah. And thank you, Professor Syed Musa Al-Habsyi,
thank you very much.
Participants today. Thank you very much. Maybe we can conclude today's event. Jika saya ada salah, saya mohon maaf kepada Prof. Syed Musa dengan seluruh partisipan. Wabillahi taufiq wal hidayah. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Thank you very much, Prof. Syed Musa.
Sama-sama. Terima kasih.
Sehat selalu, insyaAllah.